Hello, I'm going to go now over the leadership matrix and how that applies to entrepreneurship, either someone developing their own business or who is in a business, anywhere from a startup to a larger business. The sample coaching session you've seen in another video where I guided someone who was more in the startup phase of a business shows a little bit how this model is close to coaching but also to mentoring. But I kind of call this kind of coach mentoring, where you ask sometimes questions to help a client discover what are their missing ingredients. Because I think that's kind of the ultimate, if you like, covert intention of this, is for the coach to help hold up a mirror to the client so they can look at themselves and say, I have very little experience in this area, and if I'm going to succeed in business, I'll need to probably raise my game in that area. But it's also kind of a little more complex than that because of the idea of shadows and how they're sometimes expressed. Where a shadow is a, if you like, manifestation of the archetype, but in a more problematic way. So I think I've given the example before that if somebody is very forceful, they sometimes can inadvertently become very aggressive. So the boss can be forceful, but they can sort of shade over into being aggressive or bullying. Likewise, sometimes people find it very hard to express themselves, and rather than express boss energy in a sort of more general kind of calm, grounded kind of way, they tend to kind of bottle things up and then explode into bully energy. So they never really manifest that boss energy. And that's a kind of really key point, I think, in sort of learning to manage people and learning to manage emotions. So if I ask the client, say effectively there's sort of a 5-step process. Firstly, you ask the client to model or map the archetypes, those qualities, onto an exemplar or somebody who they really admire. The second point is to describe the issue and just let the client talk about whatever a problem is. It's a good idea if it's not a sort of generalized problem like they're stressed about running a business and they're a bit confused. Although that can be useful a bit later on, you encourage the client to come up with a specific issue. The benefit of that is out of a small issue is, if you like, is a bit like a seed where the real big issues can be brought to bear very clearly. But when they start with a bigger issue, it becomes a bit confusing. So it's better for them to say something like, I'm having problems with a supplier, rather than I'm confused about business. Because the problems with the supplier will quite quickly identify what are the actual real problems that they face as an individual. However, of course, you can't force the client to do this. So with step 2, describe an issue, they just talk freely and you encourage them to talk about a live issue. Step 3, transpose the issue. They then talk about that issue but using the archetypes. So if their issue was that I'm having problems with a supplier, they're consistently late on delivery, they don't have a sufficient alarm bell, I'm finding that annoying, you can say, okay, that's a great way of describing it using the archetypes, but taking ownership. How can you talk about it where you do? What can you do differently? And they might say, well, look, my architect has designed a pretty tight process of delivery. So maybe I need to consider expanding that so that rather than say we'll get delivery to you within 48 hours, we can do it within, 7 days or something. So they could adjust, there's a sense that they take ownership. Could they adjust their architect? Or they could say, my express train doesn't feel right with that, but I still think it's maybe too long. Maybe we'll bring it down to, 72 hours. Because they then say, I have a bit of an alarm bell. So they're taking ownership. They're talking about it within themselves and what resources they can to resolve the issue. And then they might talk about going into the conductor or the fox or whatever. And they're now getting a sense of how it works, and you encourage them saying, well, have you considered it from a perspective of the boss? So one of the things that's very interesting here is often when people describe something, aspects of their own character come out by what they exclude. Often I found people who are pretty forceful exclude the yin column. So they pick up lots of options like the boss, the express train and the fox, but they kind of don't mention anything about the coach, alarm bell or friend. So you can simply point to them, to the model and say, what do you see that you haven't talked about? And they look and they go, wow, that's an interesting point. I haven't talked at all about that right column. And you nod. and they say, I'm not very good at that. You nod. Say, well, how could you apply it in this context? Often that can be like an aha moment. Equally, if somebody's very engaging and wants to sort of help their clients and so forth, and is very giving and sensitive and so forth, but isn't very assertive, again, they could leave out that sort of yang column. Or they could miss out the vision column. They might be a kind of good manager, but then finding it hard to see the bigger picture and don't see the systemic problems. So that's also very interesting. And then once they do that, they see that this small problem they begin with is a kind of microcosm of a bigger problem. You will have seen in the demonstration that I mentioned the shadows of the different archetypes. So it's, again, if somebody expresses something that doesn't fit in, that's the time to explain the shadow. But I don't think there's enough time in the beginning to go through all the shadows as I do in the longer presentation video. So the last sort of part of the matrix then, in some sense, is step 5, is to encourage them to find a new strategy. So feeding back, saying, okay, well, you've mentioned that, your architect could change something, or your express train is maybe putting too much pressure on you, your alarm bell senses you don't want to make it too much slower. What could you do differently? Now that's the final piece, and they think for a moment, looking at it, and they either can come up with an idea themselves, or you can simply make a suggestion. Well, from a compass perspective, what is the bigger issue here? What is the thing you're trying to resolve? What is your vision? And they might say, well, I want to be able to deliver high quality products to my customers quickly. Well, if that's the sort of vision, then there's always the choice of replacing the supplier if the supplier isn't good enough at that delivery. So it's also a kind of sense of saying that their decision making, is it in line with that, or are they too kind of focused on the sort of smaller picture? So that's kind of an example of using all of the archetypes. And I think that brand new strategy is, if you're using this material, is just ask them to go through each one. So with this issue, how would you apply the compass? Or the ones, or the boss? You can go through all 9 of them. Also encouraging them to go into that conductor space where they get a bit of detachment. Okay, well, the final part, I suppose, with the entrepreneurship coaching is, if you're coaching an entrepreneur, depending a little bit on what level they're at, if they've just started out, as in the client's case, the situation there is that they'll probably be doing most of the things on their own or with another person. So it's kind of an important thing to help them discover what are their roles. If they're on the role on their own, they need to play all of the roles. But if they're split between 2 people, say, or 3 people, then can they kind of break those roles down so some people take responsibility for one area or another? So that can be a kind of useful thing in kind of coaching entrepreneurs who are in a team. Often people who are strong at sales tend not to be so strong at delivery. Sometimes people who are strong at accounting tend not to be so strong at either. And then, there's a good model of having some kind of leader as well. So you can use this as a sort of, kind of small business where a group of people come together. But for the individual who has a startup, then it's a case of identifying, as we did with Anna, that maybe the area that she hadn't studied before, she wasn't really particularly experienced in, was sales and marketing. So that's something which we could now develop over the course of the coaching. And I might give some suggestions of certain books. One of my own personal favourites is a book, a little out of date now, but still applies very well. It's called How to Sell Anything to Anyone by Joe Girard. I think this is kind of an excellent book about sales and marketing. And even though it may be 30 years old, it really can help somebody get the sense of that. And to encourage them to kind of see that part of their business journey is to develop the parts of themselves that they haven't. Sometimes those parts can be skills, like sales and marketing is actually a skill set. Sometimes it could be accounting or finance, could be operations, could be leadership. All of these things are sort of skills that they can develop and read and go and do courses. But I think the model is also nice because it also identifies something which is kind of a quality which they're hiding. And this is the kind of archetype model, which is kind of an important principle, kind of comes from Jungian psychology. It's the idea that different people's characters or personalities have certain strengths and weaknesses. My own belief is it's not true to say that you have to be a kind of domineering or kind of dogmatic, powerful kind of character to be successful in business. That is one quality, which is called the boss. And when it's overdone, it can be irritating and tends to break relationships. So this is one of a myriad of different qualities. Some people will have one quality, greatly and not another. So when they identify what qualities they don't have or find difficult to express, this is where the NLP coaching comes in and can be very powerful. So, for example, Anna felt some revulsion, say, towards a fox, that idea of that kind of cunning behavior, something like that. That's something that we'll be looking at in the next coaching session, using an NLP process to see where did those beliefs come from and how can they shift. Because I would argue that if they don't shift, then it's going to be very hard for someone to succeed in business if they don't like doing business, so, selling and marketing their products. It's something that they need to gain, I'd say, a good level of competence at. It's hard enough to succeed in business, and it's particularly hard if you're doing something you find very painful and you're not sure why. So that's kind of one kind of key example. The other thing is this interplay with shadows. I mentioned shadows briefly, but there is this kind of interesting dynamic with shadows where if someone expresses a shadow, let's say the shadow of the boss is a bully. If I speak personally, I would tend to go into sort of bully mode a bit because I find it hard to express boss energy. When I was managing people, I found it hard to sort of look at them and say, well, if you're going to continue being late, we're going to have to look at moving into a disciplinary process. I would be more likely to maybe make a sarcastic comment, oh, late again, or something like that. Not confronting it, the person might sort of look at me like, and ignore it until at some point I'd get really annoyed or something like that. What that means is I'm not using boss energy when it's needed. So for me, there's also this in this model, the idea of going to the conductor and saying, what is needed in this specific situation? Should I be making sarcastic or snide remarks about someone being late? Should I suddenly lose my temper with them after they've been late for like 6 months? Or would it be better for me to gently but firmly say, I'm concerned you've been late twice this week. I'd like you now to arrive on time. If you arrive late again, we're going to have to look at some disciplinary process. Just say it like that. I may not find that comfortable, I may not want to have that conversation, but it's the right thing to do rather than being sarcastic or blowing up later on. Equally, if my character was such that I found that kind of coaching quality difficult, I might like somebody to come into my office when I was a manager and say to them, okay, do this, do that, do the other. And they're sitting there sort of looking unengaged or bored. And then they don't do what I've told them to do. And I become frustrated. I would be better, even if it's not my natural inclination, to encourage a coaching approach in that management. So somebody comes in and I'll say, what is the issue you face? And I spend a bit longer. I listen. I say, what steps could you take? And they tell me what steps. And then I might comment on some of those steps or ask them further questions. And they might say, well, that's a good point. And they come up with a list and so forth. And then at the end of it, they are kind of motivated. And I would conclude by saying, it sounds like you've got an action plan here. Please would you email it to me? Because it's far better to, as they say, show, don't tell. If you tell somebody something, they may or may not do it. If they show you what they're going to do, they're much more likely to do it. Even if it takes more time, at the end it becomes more effective because also the people become more self-managing. They begin to do far more on their own. They take more responsibility, which frees up the time. And that is also another classic thing with this kind of leadership coaching. Is people say, I'm overwhelmed, I can never trust anybody to do anything. And that's because they're not engaging properly in that kind of more sophisticated management process, which I call coaching, or coaching energy in this case. And there are other ones. Sometimes people ignore that vision column. They're so kind of caught up in the detail that they don't see the sort of bigger picture. Maybe there's a problem in the culture in the team or something like that. So that's also a really kind of interesting piece. When you talk about the matrix, when people exclude a certain column, that's usually because some part of their personality they don't like to express. They find it shameful or annoying or whatever it may be. And you're saying that in order to be effective, you kind of point out to them which is a column that they habitually, or what are the squares they habitually ignore. And usually that's where they need to do the work. So my view is that the matrix provides two kind of levels. One, a kind of area for you to improve your skill set as an entrepreneur, but also a methodology to be able to really perform at your best, or at least appropriately. Because I think it's fair to say that if you behave inappropriately on a regular basis, and when I say inappropriately, I mean not being assertive when it's called for, or not being kind of soft and listening when it's called for, or not being strategic when it's called for, or whatever it may be, then your overall power will just simply reduce, because you're kind of not kind of fighting with a full deck, as it were. And business is a competitive thing, and sometimes you have to sort of press yourself to do the right thing for the business rather than the kind of comfort zone for yourself. At the same time, I think that the general kind of model that I try and encourage is saying you don't have to be brilliant at these things, which I think I've explained. It's something that you will gain, you get better at it, but it's not necessarily a natural thing for some people, which is fine. If they find going to the architect very boring, or they hate the vision, they're so cynical about it, they don't have to do it that often. It's just knowing that it's something can be important, and it's just the kind of pictures is a reminder of the places they don't visit. You just nip in there and say, what do I need to do differently? Okay, well, I hope you found that helpful. Thank you very much.